Did you know? In an early version of Portal 2, the player would have come across a cube-shaped computer that had been loaded up with Cave Johnson's entire consciousness. After realizing that there's more to life than simply existing, and that this cube was more or less a living purgatory, Johnson would beg the player to end his life by pulling the plug on his computer. The player would then have to drag the cube and use it to fill a gap in a puzzle segment, forcing players to discourteously walk over Johnson's digitized remains to reach the goal. Although unused, the gag would be repurposed over a decade later for Valve's Aperture Desk Job game. This exclusive information comes to us from Portal 2 director Josh Weier, who we interviewed for this video. We wanted to make sure we had some fun and previously unknown facts about Portal 2's cut content, so we made sure to reach out to the biggest experts on the subject, the developers themselves. It was great talking to Josh, and he told us some pretty interesting tidbits about Portal 2's development, like how Portal 2's single-player campaign originally used a hub world to access levels, rather than using the more linear story structure in the final game. Josh said, originally the game was laid out in a hub structure, so you kinda come to GLaDOS and she would be forcing you to rebuild her, and you could go down different arms of the hub and each arm would have a part you needed. A lot of the mechanics could live separately, so we were like, oh, maybe the player can just choose what they want to play. But we fell away from that idea because it wasn't that interesting. It was just something to try at the start of development. This hub world idea was later experimented with in co-op, and also led to the use of personality cores like Wheatley, with each arm of the hub also having a core associated with it. The cores were the parts Josh mentioned that players needed to bring back to repair GLaDOS. Wheatley was the only core that saw extensive use in the final game, but the other cores were all planned to have a bigger role earlier in development. Just like how the player has to carry Wheatley along with them early in the game, they'd also have to carry the other cores back to GLaDOS, all while interacting with their uniquely different personalities. One of these cut cores is the Morgan Freeman sphere, which was inspired by Morgan Freeman's wise portrayal of Ellis Boyd "Red" Redding from the 1994 movie The Shawshank Redemption. At a game developers conference panel in 2012, Portal 2 writers Eric Wolpaw and Chet Falasek delivered a presentation on creating a sequel to a game that doesn't need one. During this panel, Wolpaw gave a brief description of this unused core, saying, as an example, this was one of them, something called the Morgan Freeman sphere. So he'd been sitting on that little pedestal for a few centuries, and he was just incredibly wise, but only about the 20 by 20 space that he was in. As soon as you dragged him 22 feet out of the room, his mind was blown and he was pretty much useless. Although as the game progressed, he eventually got his feet under him and started delivering some homespun wisdom that all related back to his 20 by 20 space. This entire GDC panel is full of interesting behind-the-scenes info from Eric and Chet, such as one cut piece of content involving a bootleg Garfield. This knockoff Garfield, dubbed Dorfelt, ties into the original plan for Portal 2's co-op campaign. Co-op was at some point going to take place right after the single-player campaign and continue the story with GLaDOS all alone, trying to get her fix of chamber testing using 2 co-op robots. She'd quickly realized that she wasn't getting any new data because with no human observer, the tests are stuck in a state of quantum uncertainty, a la Schrodinger's cat. GLaDOS would then send the bots down into old Aperture to collect remnants of humanity in hopes they'd become more human themselves, and hopefully resolve this quantum observation problem. The first remnant the bots would collect would be the Dorfelt comic, but neither the bots nor GLaDOS understood why the comic is funny, so GLaDOS rewrites the comic to be funnier. The final comic shows that Dorfelt has eaten his owner's lasagna. The owner, now angry, says that he's activated the neurotoxins in the room and Dorfelt will die. Dorfelt thinks to himself, I've made terrible choices in my life, before dropping dead. We've got more exclusive Portal facts coming up, but first, a word from this episode's sponsor, Western Digital. With today's modern games, file sizes are starting to reach up to 250 gigabytes, and for many that's all the free space they have. With storage becoming ever more important in gaming, Western Digital have launched their new WD Black SN850X internal NVMe and WD Black P40 external SSD drives. These drives are specifically tailored for gamers, with the WD Black SN850X featuring performance-boosting features like predictive loading, adaptive thermal management, and overhead balancing, so that game assets load in faster, making in-game pop-in a thing of the past, all whilst maintaining high data throughput at higher ambient temperatures. It also comes in 1TB, 2TB, and 4TB capacities, and reaches speeds up to 7,300 megabytes per second. And the WD Black P40 boasts a compact, durable design with speeds up to 2,000 megabytes per second, and comes in 500GB, 1TB, and 2TB capacities. These drives are great for PC gaming and can even add additional space for your Xbox Series XS or PlayStation 5 setup. To check out these high-performance gaming SSDs, go to the Western Digital Store by clicking the links at the top of this video's description. And now, back to Portal. With the bootleg Garfield gag fresh in our minds, we decided to ask Josh Weier if he could remember the gag and how significant it was to development. He told us, "I know that the writers, they hated Garfield. They just hated the humor, they hated that Garfield was a thing, so any dig they could take at Garfield." Josh was the project lead on Portal 2, but his focus was mostly on the single player, not the co-op. Despite his recollection of co-op's development being patchy, he did give us some insight into how long the idea lasted. The Garfield comic would have been really early on, and I think it was when Eric Wolpaw and Jay Pinkerton were more in co-op. I think at a certain point Chet Falasek was running around with it a lot more, so it might have been that they handed it off to him and he took it in a different direction. I don't remember ever seeing a very concrete version of that, so it would have been pretty transient if it was there. Mostly, it was featured around the writer's hatred of Garfield. The Garfield joke was cut, but a sly Garfield reference did make its way into the game in the form of the I Hate Mondays mug that can be found on some Aperture desks. Another part of the game that saw many iterations was Wheatley. Some elements of Wheatley's personality originate from a Valve experiment called 2 Bots, 1 Wrench. And yes, that's a reference to what you think it is. The experiment explored dynamic storytelling in games and had the bots react in real time to the player's actions. The robot with the boxy design had a British accent, a cheeky demeanor, and seemed to be the stupider of the two. Sound familiar? The robot was voiced by Valve animator Richard Lord, who'd also go on to voice an early version of Wheatley back when the character was named Pendleton. Despite Richard doing a respectable job voicing Wheatley, it was never the plan to use his voice in the final game. Eric Wolpaw wanted Richard Ayoade of It Crowd fame to voice the character, believing Ayoade's voice would play into Wheatley's being a hectic and annoying presence. Back in 2011, Giant Bomb reported on an NYU Game Center talk where Eric Wolpaw mentioned how It Crowd's creator Graham Linehan was actually a big fan of Valve's games, particularly Left 4 Dead. Linehan had even sent letters to Valve a few times, so Wolpaw reached out to him and simply asked if his friend Richard would want to be in one of their games. Ayoade couldn't take the gig though. He was busy directing the indie comedy Submarine. Stephen Merchant was Wolpaw's second choice, who came to Wolpaw's attention after he saw Merchant in the BBC series Extras. The writers also knew he'd been in the British version of The Office and co-created the series, and assumed Merchant would reject their offer just because he probably had stupid amounts of money from his Office royalty checks. But to their surprise, Merchant took on the job. The team then tweaked Wheatley's dialogue to be less in line with Richard Ayoade and more in line with Merchant, using his podcast appearances to nail the pacing and delivery of Wheatley's new lines. In an episode of the Kiwi Talks podcast, Wolpaw reminisced about Stephen Merchant recording Wheatley's lines. Merchant would throw in his own ad-libbed lines, some of which were actually used, but a lot of them weren't. Wolpaw said, "Stephen Merchant would improvise in the studio, but a lot of the time, while it was really funny, he would throw around a lot of pop culture references and stuff that we couldn't use. It just wasn't what we were looking for there." But again, much like with the writing in the studio, you want to keep the energy up as well, so him just going off and ripping on something even if it was unusable was usually good just to keep everybody energized. Other Valve games like Team Fortress 2 were brimming with pop culture references, so it's easy to imagine that Valve's writers might get a little tired of including them. Sometimes they'd even cut references to other Valve games. At one point during production, Wheatley was going to make a reference to Half-Life's G-Man, with Wheatley informing the player, "A man with a briefcase was just here looking for you." Wheatley was also once planned to have a much smaller role in the game, and would stay dead after his confrontation with GLaDOS. The 6 other cores would then take on similar roles throughout the game, but the team realized the game worked better if Wheatley was there throughout, resulting in the tragic loss of the Morgan Freeman sphere. Rest in peace. Another chunk of the game left on the cutting room floor was a set of unused endings where Chell would die in unique or ridiculous ways. At that GDC panel we mentioned earlier, Eric Wolpaw stated, "A small percentage of playtesters were just fine with riding into the fire pit in Portal 1. That was a good ending for them. It was dark, but they liked it, so we thought, we'll service those people. So we had these parts throughout the game where Chell would die and that would be the end and we'd play a song. And if you wanted to, you could just quit there. We had one that was like 2 minutes into the game, and if you died there was a song that was just about reviewing those first 2 minutes. Another one of these death endings could happen during a scene where the moon was visible to the player. If the player shot a portal nearby and then the other at the moon, they'd get slung through the portal and onto the moon and would die of asphyxiation while a sad song about the moon played. We loved the idea of these endings, and since we had Josh Weier on the line, we asked him why they were cut. Josh told us that the team only had time to do a handful of these special death endings, so there'd end up being lots of spots in the game perfect for death endings, but they wouldn't have any time to make them. And if you were a player going through the game trying to find all the death endings, you'd probably be disappointed when you came across a spot that was perfect for one but didn't have anything there. Given the workload needed and the inevitable inconsistency of the execution, they decided against including them. In an interesting twist, these scrapped endings would inspire the team to make Portal 2's final ending. Up until their realization to use the moon, their ideas for the game's ending were kinda lame. One idea they experimented with saw Chell finally speak, with the middle mouse button making her mutter the word "yes" to deactivate Wheatley. The team thought it'd be funny, but when they tried it out, in Wolpaw's words, boy did it suck. At a PAX Prime panel in 2012, Wolpaw dropped one of the quirkier cut ideas for Portal 2. Chell was once planned to stumble upon a group of abandoned turrets that were behaving like a lost tribe in some remote area of the world. She'd then help the clan in some undisclosed way, and in return, the Animal King turret would marry Chell to one of the turrets. This turret bride would then follow Chell around for the rest of the game in a similar fashion to Watson in Sherlock Holmes' Nemesis. And for those who don't get the reference, Sherlock Holmes' Nemesis is a PC adventure game where Watson tends to be in almost every cutscene, just standing there, not saying a word. The Animal King appears briefly in the game's ending and in an animation on a monitor, but the turret Chell was meant to marry also appears in the game. It's the opera turret that sings during the game's ending. We were curious where all these turret shenanigans originated, so we asked Josh Weier if he had any insight. Josh told us, "So Richard Lord is a super talented artist. He was responsible for all those infographics, that style, and he'd been building those infographic movies forever, just because he was interested and liked that style. That was part of why they ended up in the game. So as he was working on the turret, there's the gag where you see the turret with all the different skins, and at some point I think he took the leopard print one and put a little crown on it. I think he was just amusing himself, but everyone thought that was funny, so he put it in that video." And while we were talking to Josh about unusual characters, we also asked him about the Rat Man, specifically if he was ever going to appear in Portal 2, and it seems like the team briefly considered it. I think we didn't spend a long time on that because there's always this thing in games where you can make it look really good and timeless until you show a person, and then you instantly date your game. So you can see Chell through portals, but you never really see her that up close. You see her arms a little bit sorta at the end. And so I think we knew that if we throw the Rat Man in there, we have a ton of art issues like, can we make that look good? It's a lot of animation. Are we really gonna have the time to pull that off in a way that's gonna make you go, oh, there's the Rat Man, I really get it. Josh went on to say that thanks to some of the team's experience working on games like Half-Life 2, they knew they'd have their hands full with character AI, and how the Rat Man would interact with things like portals and even the player. In the end, it wouldn't have been worth the investment. Developers had to make other kinds of concessions relating to characters. At that NYU panel we mentioned earlier, Eric Wolpaw alluded to one of the origins of GLaDOS's harsh critiques of the player. I was a fat kid my whole life, and I had this passive-aggressive grandmother who was always needling me about it. That's kind of where that came from. But GLaDOS's trademark chastising went a little bit too far for some in Portal 2, and the team had to dial it back. Wolpaw said, "We definitely took some stuff out that was hated by playtesters. We got a lot of feedback on the initial GLaDOS arc after you wake her up that she was just too vicious and mean, and people were kind of getting ground down by how awful she was being to you. Even Ellen McLean in the studio was kind of nervous about reading some of the stuff. She was like, wow, that's harsh." The team had to scale back GLaDOS's ribbings even more once she was shrunk down to a potato. Since she was now small and dependent on Chell, the player would have felt no incentive to carry her around if she's just berating you the entire time. Speaking of which, there was a running gag that was almost entirely cut from GLaDOS' potato arc. The team felt a need to invent a reason to justify why GLaDOS wasn't helping the player complete test chambers during this segment, as her and the player's goals were now aligned. The team originally planned for a bird to come in at the start of every new chamber and eat a piece of the potato powering GLaDOS, making her a little dumber each time. But they came up with the much simpler justification that Aperture AIs would feel pain if they helped the test subject beat a chamber. The bird gag was repurposed and spread out across the game in other ways, but still plays a critical part in GLaDOS' potato arc. Portal 2 actually had many revisions like this. Co-op started out with 2 human characters, Chell and Mel. Mel was the original protagonist of Portal 2's single-player campaign before being relegated to co-op, and she was ultimately cut altogether. Since players can interact with each other in co-op, they can harm each other in over-the-top, slapstick ways like dropping boxes on each other or making them fall through a portal in the sky. Although the developers apparently thought it was pretty funny to see human test subjects plummet to their deaths, it caused playtesters to be far more cautious in co-op, as they didn't want to die and fail the test chamber. The devs wanted to keep the slapstick nature of the deaths, but they also didn't want to discourage players. Their solution was to replace the human models with robots, and make it clear to players that robots can respawn by having them disassembled at the end of every test chamber. In 2010, Valve artist Matt Charlesworth told Game Informer a little about the process of creating the co-op protagonists Atlas and Peabody. The co-op bots at the very beginning had a very Westworld feel. We wanted them to look human but feel robotic. They eventually developed into being these far more graphic, very industrial-looking robots. We took turrets and the personality spheres and integrated them into the designs. The playable characters weren't the only aspect of co-op that had to be heavily reworked. At one point, the team planned for GLaDOS to drive a wedge between players in co-op, with the idea that players would see through her scheme and it would actually pull them closer together. However, competition is the antithesis of cooperation, and any dialogue that tried to feed into the competitive nature of players got negative feedback during testing. Eric Wolpaw told PC Gamer, "We actually toyed with having GLaDOS say one thing to one player, but she's whispering another thing to the other player. But that wasn't working for various reasons, plus it would have required twice as much content, because we also needed a complete story that didn't have that for when you were playing split screen. It was kind of fun for a little bit, but for the effort it'd take to replicate a completely different story without that, the joke wasn't so good that it was worth doing that." Another cut set of lines for GLaDOS saw her randomly assigning points to players. Wolpaw continued, "She was doing this thing where she would start randomly assigning points for doing nothing, basically. And people would try to figure that out and they would be like, 'I want these points.' And they were meaningless. She was just arbitrarily assigning points. Sometimes they weren't even points, she'd give you like 4 pineapples or something. The points weren't real, but gamers' relentless craving for points made them blind to GLaDOS' deceit. It didn't make any difference. For most people, it just wasn't working. It sounded great in theory, it's still a good joke when you say it, but in the actual playing of it, it was falling a little bit flat. It was A, confusing people, and then B, making them angry. Co-op saw many cuts during production, but the biggest aspect of multiplayer to get scrapped was an entire game mode. The developers experimented with a competitive multiplayer mode that's been described as Speedball meets Portal, with Speedball being a 1988 cyberpunk sports game that's a bit like a cross between handball and ice hockey. And although multiple devs have made this comparison, according to writer Chet Falasek, it had none of the good parts of either of those two games. The team worked on this game mode for 1 or 2 months, but the chaos was only briefly satisfying and got old fast. Eric Wolpaw told the now-defunct OneUp.com, "It quickly became apparent that while it's fun for about 2 seconds to drop portals under people and things like that, it quickly just evolves into pure chaos. It lost a lot of the stuff that was really entertaining about Portal, which was puzzle solving. Cooperative puzzle solving was just a much more rewarding path." Did you also know that there's a cancelled Nintendo DS Zelda game that no one knew about until we found it? For more on that, check out our video on screen. We'll be covering more Portal content soon, so stay tuned for that. And special thanks to Josh Weier. If you want to check out what he's up to after leaving Valve, check out this Mist Life sci-fi puzzle game Zero page. There's a link to that below. Thanks for watching.